Pleasure to join you.
Of 2.7%. GDP for 2020 plunging by about 10.3%. 2021 would have seen recovery, but just at about 8%. 3 months later, the picture is definitely rosier. In its World Economic Outlook put out in January, the IMF now sees India improving and growing its GDP by 11.5% in 2021. That's an increase of 2.7% and will possibly be the fastest growing GDP in the world. So what is behind this uptick? And can this recovery truly sustain? We're speaking today with Geeta Gopinath, Chief Economist at the IMF, in her first and exclusive interview on the World Economic Outlook to ET Now. Ms. Gopinath, thank you so much for speaking with us. It's a pleasure. Let me dive straight in and ask you about your 2021 projections for India's growth. What is behind this uptick? Is it simply a low base effect? Because as per the Jan outlook, we will shrink by minus 8% in the year 2020. And would you say it is a secular growth?
Tamanna, a pleasure to join you. So indeed, like you said, there is an important component, which is a base effect. When you shrink by around 8% in 1 year, then the numbers for the recovery the following year just get bigger. But just to be very clear, this is indeed an upgrade from what we had in October, and there are a couple of reasons for it. One is when the economy reopened, activity came back somewhat faster than we had anticipated. And even more importantly, unlike in other parts of the world, when typically reopenings have been associated with another surge of infections, in India, on the other hand, there is a very steady, very strong decline in the number of total active cases that we're seeing there, which I'm told by some experts is a reflection that in some of the major cities, you are getting to 40-50% of people who have the antibodies in them. And so if that continues, I think that those are promising aspects of a recovery into 2021. I also want to flag one other thing, which is that given where India's growth potential, which is anywhere between 6 and 7%, on a typical year, relative to that, of course, there's still a lot of ground to cover. So by the end of 2022, India is still, based on the current projections, around 9% below where it would have been in the absence of this pandemic. So there is still ground to cover, but indeed this is an upward revision that we have right now.
Ms. Gopinath, hi, good evening. This is Ruchi Bhatia. Appreciate you taking your time out and speaking with us. While you did talk about the fact that we have a lot of ground to cover, and that is something that everybody is also watching out for in the upcoming budget as well. I want to understand from you, in your World Economic Outlook for the month of January, you have pointed that while vaccine approvals coupled with the government measures have raised hopes of a sharp turnaround later this year, you have warned that delay in vaccine rollout and a widespread hesitancy in inoculation could be some of the worries. How big a downside risk really it is?
This is a concern for almost all countries in the world. They've embarked on vaccinations. India has done it in a very ambitious way. And of course, you need to have sufficient uptake and rollout. Now, I think the other piece that we are concerned about are the new variants of the virus. We've seen that building up antibodies to one of the virus variants doesn't give you immunity to all the new kinds. And so I think that's where the risk also lies, which is if you have newer variants that come into the country, then that can lead to another round of cases going up in infections. And that's, I would say, is one of the major downside risks. The other downside risk for India is with regard to the financial vulnerabilities in the system. Remember, lots of pandemic measures have been put in place in India and everywhere else in the world. But in India, given where the financial system was entering this crisis, that could be one serious headwind going forward. If there is a rise in non-performing loans, and the RBI has projected that there could be a significant rise in there, the impact that can have on the banking sector, on the NBFCs, that could be, have a negative effect on the prospects, and that's another headwind to keep in mind. But on the other hand, if the global economy is recovering strongly all across, which is possible if there is better news on how vaccinations are going, then in that case, that would be a positive boost for India.
Just to follow up, Ms. Gopinath, on the question of, vaccine hesitancy, and India has just about started our vaccine rollout. We've vaccinated about 23 lakh people so far, but just phase 1 is supposed to be 30 crores. Looking at the size of the population which needs to be vaccinated, and this whole debate whether vaccines should be free, should they be subsidized, who should get them, do you think that for India it is very important, imperative in fact, to push the pedal in vaccinating a large part of the population?
I do think that, accelerating vaccinations is a top priority. And in the case of India, of course, again, the evidence is that there are a large number of people who were probably infected in an asymptomatic fashion, because of which they have the antibodies. So that's why it's, at least in India, that it doesn't look like it's a race between the virus and the vaccine. But again, the only way you can help prevent additional strains from developing and a further surge in another surge of the pandemic is indeed to accelerate the rollout of vaccinations and assure people that, once these vaccines have passed through serious regulatory controls, that they will be safe to take.
Right. Ms. Gopinath, in India, the big event that we all are watching out for will be the upcoming budget. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman has promised a budget like never before. I want to understand from you, the government so far has announced, a massive package in terms of the Atmanirbhar Bharat package, the 3 tranches that they launched. In terms of what can we look forward to in the upcoming budget? In your view, what should be the priorities? Yesterday's press conference, you also spoke about reforms that the Indian government should undertake. In terms of the upcoming budget, what would you say would be the topmost priority for Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman?
So the upcoming budget will have to do 2 things, which is, first, it will have to tackle the current crisis and at the same time doing it with an eye on the future, which is putting in place the necessary reforms that are needed to accelerate the recovery and put India on a faster growth trend. Now, what exactly would that be? So firstly, if you look at the social sector, I think for now there is a good argument to extend some of the pandemic support measures that were provided, which were lifelines to poor households, that in kind and in cash, that expired in 2020, that there's a good argument for extending that for 2021. Similarly, in the case of Manrega, they had expanded the scope of Manrega in 2020. Keeping that expanded scope for another year may be a useful thing to do, given again that the economy has not fully recovered. And remember, the numbers that we have usually don't capture well the informal sector, which has been very hard hit, and medium and small enterprises that have been hard hit during these times. And then on the health front, they have, expenditure has been put in now to make sure that the vaccinations roll out at a faster pace. I mean, that would be what is needed now. But again, then looking forward, India is a country that needs to scale up its allocation to health. It's about 1% of its GDP is typically what gets spent by the government on the health sector, which is much lower than its peers in terms of emerging markets. You need to ramp that up. A healthier population is a more productive population. You have less helps with poverty reduction. So that would be the forward-looking piece of it. The other social sector aspect is on education. this past year has had a huge toll on the education of millions in children in India. Because distance learning doesn't really work that well for a large number of people. So how do you rectify that? I think that has to be an important piece of what goes into the budget. Then there is the next part, which is on the firms. Again, MSMEs have had a particularly hard time in India, and this is true, by the way, in every part of the world. In this crisis, lifelines were provided mostly in the form of liquidity. It's important to see how well they're working. And whether more support is needed. Maybe some of this has to be more above the line measures as opposed to below the line measures. Then there is the banking system, which is going to, come out as this crisis progresses, and as you start even the recovery, you're going to see more non-performing loans that can show up. That would require, I think there's an argument for banks and for NBFCs to raise capital at this point. Given how easy the financing conditions are, but there could be a reason for capital support from the government into the banking